Hey, thank you very much. It's actually my honor to be at the Morton Arboretum. Ever since I was a student, I always thought this was a great place. All the great research, and to actually be able to speak here today on ice storms, it's very humbling for me. So how many of you actually love ice storms? When I was a kid, I tell you what, that Easter 1976 ice storm, the Olympics had just watched those, and we had this luge hill that we set up, and then the ice storm came. Talk about a better thing for a kid. No school, and your luge little playground area is now iced over. Yeah, for most people, that's not the experience where you get this picturesque ice storm gleaming in the trees, or, you know, cascading on the leaves, all that weight. There's some beauty to this picture, no doubt about it, but not when they come tumbling down. So we'll talk about some reasons why trees fail in ice storms, but there's certainly some beauty to it, even in the literature. Mark Twain, perhaps you read The Equator, okay? It's an older publication from 1897, but he talks about the ice storm, and even the laziest of sleepers throw off the covers and join the rush for the windows. To hear the bang, the thunder, the clap, the report-like rifle-like sound when a branch comes tumbling to the ground. The not-so-beauty, bent stems, broken branches. And if I was a gymnast, this is what I'd look like. I'm not flexible, this river birch here. You know, damaged vehicles. If you're a Chevy Chevette owner, I was one of those, travesty, trashed. You know, if you're an optimist, you can say, well, it's time to remodel the front porch, okay? But obviously there's a cost to repairing this damage. Or if you've got your ash tree that now looks like a teepee because it's all busted up, okay? Obviously these are the problems that we often deal with and think about with ice storms. And I often think about what's the worst that could happen? Well, if you're a city forester and you wake up at night and you hear the thunder, the bang, the crash, now you have to think about debris. And you have to think about, did I actually put together a management plan to mobilize forces in the event of a storm? And obviously, I'm not going to talk about pre-storm planning, but certainly that's a huge part. I'm sure ComEd Edison, I know they have a war room when it deals with storms, because I've seen it before, actually. But you've got all this debris on the ground, and how do you bring back your town in a very timely manner? The other part of ice storms, okay, you'll get these statistics, and you go online and find these very easily. This was one from a couple years ago where a Midwest ice storm left 23 people dead, 1 million people were without power, and 400 O'Hare flights canceled. Well, I thought that's kind of a normal day at O'Hare. But nonetheless, 1 million people without power. And this is a typical Midwestern storm where you've got maybe 3-4 states covered. Ice storms happen on common frequency, we'll talk about that. 23 people that were killed in this storm. What do you think the number one reason why people die during ice storms? What do you think it's from? Trees falling on them or something else? Not electrocution, not trees. Carbon monoxide poisoning. Power's out. What do you think they want to do? Fire up the hibachi in the house. Not a good idea. Don't do it. So yeah, carbon monoxide poisoning is actually one of the number one reasons why people die during ice storms. Primary cause of outages. Ice storms are a huge reason why trees actually fail and then take out the power. Anybody recognize a famous Chicago landmark in this picture here? Yeah, O'Hare. This is actually a picture I found online from the 1920s. Nonetheless, in the severe ice storms, they can even take down transmission towers. Okay. Now, this is a severe ice storm event. If you remember the ice storm event of 1988, okay, it was kind of a catastrophic ice storm event where 4 million people were without power. Huge. Transmission towers actually came down. Well, here's a statistic. They say 60% of winter storm losses come from ice storms. I've seen the statistic. I've tried to verify it again. Don't know if it's exactly 60%. We've heard a few different numbers here. But nonetheless, University of Illinois, Chagnon and his colleagues actually have quantified from a little under 100 ice storm events, they found over $16 billion worth of damage. Now, this is just not tree damage. This is structure damage, but the urban forest is part of this. On average, about $250,000 a year, or $250 million, I should say, of damage is attributed to ice storms. So obviously ice storms are a very common event and also a very costly event. This 1998 ice storm that I was talking about, they called it the storm of the century, okay, where you had 4 million people without power, 40 deaths from this storm, and in the billions of dollars from just damage to infrastructure like utilities, homes, and certainly loss of the urban forest. Urbana, Illinois, the Valentines Storm of 1990. Anybody remember that storm? Did it get actually in the Chicago area, this particular ice storm? Okay, Jim Scare was actually wise. Jim Scare had a tree inventory, and actually after, it was fortuitous. He had the inventory, ice storm happens. He thinks, wow, I've got some damage. I'm going to FEMA. He was actually able to get money from FEMA to help cover the loss of this public utility, the urban forest. Now, this is the only time I actually know of, and Jim actually has been working with FEMA and other federal agencies to actually kind of bring back this concept that the urban forest is part of our infrastructure, and if you can pay for bridges and roads from storms, why can't you pay for the urban forest? So that may be something actually on the horizon, which is, you know, making lemonade out of lemons, perhaps. Now, how do ice storms happen? And this is where I can be the meteorologist. You've got a warm air mass that's coming up over top of a cold air mass, and what happens is you get this water that's super cooled. And usually it's below freezing, about 25 degrees Fahrenheit or so. And it's actually super cooled. It's not frozen, but it hits the surface in areas that are below freezing and almost freezes instantly on contact. Okay, so you've got this event that's actually set up where you've got a warm air mass going over a cold air mass, and the super cooled rain, when it does fall, it's just primed to freeze on surfaces. Okay? Now, you can have an ice storm event, and on different sides of the fronts, you could have rain. You could have, fortunately, just a blizzard, okay, and not the ice storm, because a blizzard you can usually deal with. Get the tractor out, push the snow, all is well after a couple days. An ice storm, you've got the damage you have to deal with for quite some time. Now, how common are these things? This above-ground map actually was generated by the telegraph operators. Okay, back in 1800s, early 1900s, they get this new technology, the telegraph. Now we've got Twitter, they had the telegraph. It's basically the same thing. You want to have as few characters as possible because it costs money to transmit stuff, apparently. But nonetheless, telegraphs were going down, and so they started quantifying data. Where is this happening most commonly? And they came up with this map. And from this map, what did they say? Well, where you have a heavy ice loading area, what do? You build a beefier system, okay, to deal with the extra weight that occurs from loading of ice. Where you have areas like Florida, and they don't have ice storms down Miami, but actually in northern Florida, on rare occasions, they can get those. Now, this is a more recent map. Does this look pretty similar to this? These are isobars, nonetheless, so they've quantified Central Illinois, on average, you get about 5 days of freezing rain, okay? Now, that's not an ice storm. That's just where you've got some rain that freezes on contact. It could just be a veneer, small amount. But isn't there some similarity on this overall pattern in these isobars? Okay, so yeah, this is much more collected from a lot more, over 1,000 weather stations. But nonetheless, the general pattern is still there. Now, if you go to Illinois specifically, this little band of central Illinois typically is always referred to as the hot spot. Ironically, the hot spot for ice storms. But nonetheless, this is where you get the most freezing events. Now, I said freezing events. What makes an ice storm? Anybody know the actual amount of precipitation you have to have freezing on contact to be considered an ice storm? 1/4 inch. Okay, fun fact of the day, use that at home when you get home. But nonetheless, once you get a 1/4 inch or more, that's officially an ice storm. Now, 1/4 inch of ice, do you think you're going to get much damage? No, later on today we'll actually talk about some damage amounts. And usually not until you get maybe a 1/2 inch or more is when you start getting some minor levels of damage that you can start seeing. It's amazing how much actual weight can be held from a tree branch. They have reports where the branch didn't fail, and they had 100 times the weight of that branch, okay? So someone actually collected the twig, they weighed it, they melted all the ice off, and then they weighed it again, 100 times, okay? And this wasn't a branch on the ground, so there's a report actually up to that amount. I'm going to suspect most trees don't get to that level, but nonetheless, it amazes me how much force you can actually hold. One of the earliest reports. Now, how did I actually get involved with ice storms? It was fall of 1992. I started my master's work at the University of Illinois. My master's advisor, Jeff Dawson, says, hey, can you verify in the library that there's nothing in the literature on ice storms? I'm thinking, yeah, I can do that, Jeff. So I go to the library, and I could sit around for a couple hours, come back to Jeff. Hey, Jeff, I didn't find anything. Well, fortunately for me at that time, they're developing this new browser called Mosaic. Remember that thing? Okay, now it's Netscape. I think they have like 0.02% of the market. But nonetheless, they also had these phenomenal search engines available at the University of Illinois. So I could just, as a putz master student, type in ice storm trees, and boom, 30 publications. University of Illinois had a phenomenal library system, and I could actually get many of these publications within just minutes almost of finding it on the computer. Okay, and so actually it started on this whole path of just fascination about trees and ice storms. One of the first ones that I could actually find in the stacks, 1900, and actually von Schrenk described ice storms. Okay, that's a start. And he talked about the damage potential of these things. He talked about the scope or the area. Okay, he talked about the amount of damage, and he made these conclusions. exacerbated by ice accumulation and strong winds. Now, some will actually debate about the wind part, whether it has an influence or not. It's interesting when you get in the literature, but he made these observations. The other thing with ice loading, okay, and how do trees actually get damaged? Obviously, the duration of a storm and the intensity, how much rain is falling and how long. Okay, that's a common parameter. Geographical location. It's kind of interesting of where you are on a mountain and has an influence of what temperature it's at. That's what we're getting at there. The amount of wind. And ironically, on the windward side, you don't always get as much damage. In some cases, actually, the ice is not accumulated. On the leeward side, sometimes you get more damage. Tree attributes. We'll get into these factors later here. The spatial scale of the storm could be another factor. Is it just Illinois, or is it Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Tennessee, etc.? And forest stand density, okay? So why do trees fail from ice storms? What do you think? What's the number one reason why trees fail? Because they're weak? That was a starting point for us. We're like, well, let's look at the literature and see. That was a premise. You often hear trees, weak-wooded trees fail, trees are brittle. Those are all things I was brought up with as a undergrad student. When we started looking at things, we couldn't find that necessarily in the literature, nor when we looked at some specific strength properties of trees, and I'll show that in the next slide. And so I'm scratching my head talking with Jeff, and Jeff comes in the lab, tells his typical joke of the day. He was a good joke teller, still is. And I'm scratching my head, Jeff, I can't, this weak-wooded stuff, not finding it. And Jeff scratches his head. He cranks out on this edit on the paper, and he says, well, wood strength is less important than the ability to withstand breakage. I'm like, wow, that's golden. So basically what Jeff told me was the more force you have on something, the more likely it is to break. Now, the interesting thing is what you want to quantify is where is that breaking point for things. The biomechanics of trees certainly is bringing that to light these days. But I thought that was a really cool idea Jeff had, so I have to give him credit for that. Certainly, so what we did find out, tree failure, the amount of ice that's actually accumulating is a good predictor. We'll get at that, actually, some models at the end. And ultimately exceeds the capacity to hold. That's just obviously a very novel statement. Yeah, so when you have too much force, things break. Okay, so here's this set of trees that failed in ice storm in Urbana. And so the poster child of tree failure, Siberian elm. Does that surprise you? Not at all. But number 2, honey locust. Wow, isn't that a strong tree? And if you look at actually some things with specific gravity or modulus of rupture and modulus elasticity, now these are all wood products specifications. So basically what it comes down to is a wood product specialist takes a beam of a certain dimension, puts it between 2 blocks, and takes a force, for example. How much force does it take to break that wood? Okay, so that's modulus of rupture. So the bigger the number, the more force it takes to break something. And so what do you see there? Honey locust, pretty strong. That was number 2 on the list. Unfortunately, didn't have any modulus of rupture, specific gravity stuff, or Siberian elm. But arborvitae. Actually, we had no trees that were arborvitae that actually failed. Okay, but if you'd make your conclusion on these specific strengths of wood, very elastic. It has a small, one of the least amount of force to rupture a beam, and its specific gravity is pretty light. Okay, but what does you think that tree have for its advantage? It's like a good gymnast. It doesn't break. Not like me. I'm more like the honey locust. Snap. Okay, and so snapping these trees, and it's not atypical. You'll go after an ice storm. These are some shots I took down Arkansas. And a major ice storm happened, I forget the date, but I remember the trip. It was one of these family trips where my sister-in-law wins a trip any place in the world. Okay, and she had like a voucher for $1,500, and she picks Arkansas in July. Of all places. And actually it was pretty cool because I was working on some tree debris modeling, and ice storms had just hit Arkansas that winter, and it actually helped me overcome some puzzling I had though. These are all trees that kind of snapped because of the loading exceeding it. Certainly pre-existing conditions. Okay, oh by the way, I've got these freebies. I knew I had a couple of these. I thought I had like 10 left, and I found a stash of mini, so if you want to pass these around, trees and ice storms, they're actually still a little cold. That's actually designed that way, publication-wise. Trees and ice storms, it should be a cold publication. No, they're sitting out in my car. But pre-existing defects, wounds, certainly is something that comes to light. I can't tell you exactly the number of trees that fail during ice storms because of this, but from observations, this is one thing that you can certainly see. And you heard statistics today from Com Edison. over 80% of the trees that fail during storms are pre-existing defects. Is that what I heard, Emily? Okay, I thought I heard that, but something from Gary Johnson, my colleague, University of Minnesota, he actually has found trees that fail during storms, over 80% of them are pre-existing defects that you can quantify. Why did this tree fail? Honey locust, by the way. You see some decay, and actually, does it have a cable? It could, if that's the first time I've ever observed a cable in here. But if you look where it failed up there, it was actually decay, okay? It doesn't have that nice jagged edge of fibers. Actually, it fractured at an area that was very weak. Why did this tree fail? It was dead, okay? See the root plate there, or the lack thereof, and the dead branches up above? One thing as we quantified and looked through the literature, there was actually some things that came up. Some things about trees architecturally that make them more resistant. Okay, one thing we can look at is actually excurrent form. Okay, so a conifer. Interesting enough, you can look at loblolly pine. Here's a tree species. It's southeastern range of the United States is where it's naturally. The southern source of that tree is like a lollipop. It's a round ball on a stick. Okay, the northern form of that tree is more excurrent form. Okay, and actually, if you look at where these trees have been planted in a common garden where they get ice storms, the southern seed sources tend to get more damage from ice storms than the northern. Why? Probably because of the tree architectural form. So excurrent or favorable branch attachment, so you don't have inclusions of bark. The ability to be flexible, like our arborvitae. And certainly coarse branching was something that came through. Also, if it's in a protected site, so an area that's not getting the ice loading. Some of the things that made things more susceptible that we found, certainly the opposite of excurrent, more of a decurrent. And so what do? You get a branch, and you get more area to accumulate that force, okay? And that force, then maybe it fails down here. Maybe it's with a defect, or maybe no defect at all. But more of a loading area that you're actually getting. Some of the other things, fine branching. So Siberian elm, what makes that thing the poster child for failure? It's very finely branched. It accumulates a lot of weight, okay, by having that fine branch structure versus being more coarsely branched like a black walnut. So root damage, okay. Now, in the rural literature, actually this is something that pops up of trees failing because of pre-existing root architectural issues. The urban forest, there's no studies I know of that have actually quantified that, but certainly we do have root systems that get damaged just from our infrastructure and repair thereof. Root profile and tipping. Now this is observational, okay, and I don't know of any good studies where empirically they quantify the data, but you see this listed in the literature that the trees that were more shallow rooted or trees that had a very moist soil would fail more than soil that's drier. So this is just kind of fortuitous. Do you have a dry soil or not? Okay, but contrast some of the oak species, the ones that were more deeper rooted, were less prone for failure. One thing you have to deal with is residual damage. Now, if you ever dealt with ice storms, okay, do you take care of all the problems within a month? Or do you also get some problems that reoccur a year later? Okay, you get them a year later. Why? Because you get like this branch right here. Now, this is a malus species. It broke, the weight goes away, and that branch comes back together. And you may not even be able to see that little fracture from just a ground observation. But a year later, you get a storm, you've got that pre-existing weakness, and then it actually fails, okay? Some work that Kevin Smith did where they followed the ice storm of 1998. They came back 5 or 10 years later and looked at just the amount of compartmentalization and decay that was starting in tree stems. So certainly it sets up a process that maybe even 10, 20 years down the road that we get tree failure because of that initial ice storm that you kind of forget about that. We can just call it residual damage. Trees that are on the edge. Okay, and you heard that earlier this morning from Mark, that you get those unbalanced nature of crowns, and it may have a greater influence for failure. And this again was some observational things we saw on the Sangamon River, if I pronounced that correctly, where the edge trees seem to be more prone to failure than those in the woods. Branch shedding, and so you've got trees down below in the understory of a forest that get damaged from the branches that fail up above, so that's another thing that can cause damage from ice storms. So now, wrapping up, getting on the home stretch here, how do you prevent and manage for ice storms? Well, number one, anything you know about tree risk management is, what's one of the big things besides a tree being prone for failure is what? The target. Okay, so if it does fail, what's the catastrophic event? Is it going to take out a Chevy Chevette? or half the town's electrical power. Okay, so just from some preventative or proactive means, taking care of trees before they fail. In Siberian elm here. Here's the part where it's really good right after lunch to throw some mathematical equations up here. And here's what this is saying. Okay, this is a model from Lafon. And what he did is he looked at 5 storms where they looked at the proportion of trees damaged, so the Y, and he looked at the amount of ice thickness. And so actually from 5 studies, they had and I don't remember the R square, it was actually okay, where you could predict how much damage actually would be typical in a forest stand based by just one variable ice loading. Okay, and what they found with a typical ice storm, which is about 4/10 or 1 centimeter of thickness of ice accumulation, is on a typical ice storm, you're going to get about maybe 10% of a forest that has some sort of damage. Now, it could be whole tree failure, or it could just be a branch that was broken. So that's a typical ice storm, okay? We did some work, and actually I had a project with the Forest Service, and initially it was going to be a project where we were going to develop in rapid real time, take remote sensing information, a few other things, my knowledge about trees and how they fail in ice storms, and within a half a day have figured out the amount of debris on the ground. Okay, and I had a great grad student that flaked out on me. It was an unfortunate thing. And I didn't know much about remote sensing, and then I started thinking, what are some other ways we could actually tackle this project? My Forest Service cooperators were great. We spent most of the money, and they said, well, don't worry about it. Just give the last $7,000 back and call it good. And I'm like, can't do it. So I came up with an alternative way, and I think actually was better, a little easier. It actually, we looked at our variables. So I'm down in Arkansas, and I'm stressing about this project. You ever see the movie What About Bob? Okay, get away from your problems. So on day 5 of vacation, I'm in a ball field in Arkansas. It was actually a mild summer. It wasn't that hot down there in July. And I'm looking in this field going, how much debris do you have where you have no trees? None. That was my starting point of a model. So I just started thinking that day, what are some things? Obviously ice accumulation. I started thinking, what about the area of a town? Or how about the miles of street miles? What about wind? What about canopy cover? So we had a few other things we threw in a model. And the things in green are things that shook out. The one thing that didn't shake out was canopy cover, which I scratched my head on. The thing, if you know anything about canopy cover and NLCD data, National Land Classification Database, it's kind of coarse 30-meter resolution stuff. So one of these days I'm going to get an industrial set of students to actually do canopy analysis for the 60 towns we actually had part of this data set. But street distance and ice thickness, and another model I had was the area of a town, ice thickness actually shook out. And so basically what it says is the more street distance, this is cubic yards of debris, and as ice thickness increases, cubic yards of debris that you could expect in a regional area. Here's the same model on an area basis. And this is all our data sets. So each one of these little diamond shaped is the actual amount of debris. And with a 95% confidence, most of our towns actually fit the model. And actually, if you look at the entire town, you can actually predict, based on the average size of town or study site, our 95% confidence interval and the amount of debris that you could expect. So from a pre-planning, if I'm a public works director, city forester, I could say, well, worst case of events, what could I do? Okay, I could start pre-planning, worst case, 5 to 6 inches of ice. That's the ice storm of 1998. Most ice storms, though, what, 1, 2 inches on a severe level. So you could start thinking, how many trucks do I actually have to actually collect debris on the street? I did this actually last night or early this morning, can't remember what, for Naperville. And so for Naperville, if you want this slide, I'll give it to you for no cost, okay? Consultant would charge you $100 probably. Nonetheless, you could actually pre-plan for Naperville because on your public works site, you said you had this amount of street miles and your land area was actually this. So tree architecture, in the book, we have all these great publications. So I talked about things that are small trees, coarse, branched versus like finely branched things. And so we redid this actually a few years ago. And nice thing is I added to the list, and everything we had before didn't change, except for a couple species where we had an N of 1, and it actually changed from maybe resistant to intermediate or susceptible to intermediate. So most of the things we said before shook out again, which is always nice. So Siberian elm, poster child. I don't think anybody plants it, but if you've ever been to Rantoul, Illinois, that town's blessed with it. Okay, Bradford Pear, Aristocrat Pear. This one breaks up, this one isn't. Architecturally, they're different. Leave it alone, river birch. A week later, Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, ice went away. What did it do? All right, so recovery from ice storms can take a slow process, crash can be months later. Residual damage got a plan for? Sometimes repair makes it worse. And what's the worst that can happen? Well, the ice storm. I thank you for your time, and I'm between beer and my talk, so I'm going to end now. If you didn't get a publication, they're here. If you want a couple, then I don't have to bring them home. So I thank you for the time, and thanks for bringing me Morton.